So welcome to today's session. This is session 2 of Getting Grief Ready at Work, a starter kit workshop series. So today, this is me, the person talking. If we haven't met yet, my name is Leora. Again, I'm the School Mental Health Field Director for the Pacific Southwest MHTTC. MP Mary Pauline is from and represents Workplace Resilience, our partner at the dinner party. And Dr. David Schoenfeld is the director of the National Center for School Crisis and Bereavement. And together, the three of us are coming together to host this session. And we were also part of all of the work last year that fed the starter kit, which is the text of our work today. Today, we're doing a second part, double click into the starter kit series. And you can go to the session's main page and download the starter kit. And this is the main text that we'll be studying today, so please have it with you. And if you don't have it with you, still stay with us because we'll be prompting you and you can reflect separately from it. But it's a really core text from us. Today we'll be thinking about part 1, grief readiness at work. Part 2, being a manager, supervisor, or leader in the context of loss. So many of you last week said, whoa, I hadn't even thought about grief readiness beyond 3 days of bereavement. That grief readiness is a skill, an attribute, a way of being and doing in the world as a manager and leader. And then at the end, we'll talk about creating a grief readiness plan, which really can just look like a one thing that you are doing differently for yourself and others. So we are defining grief readiness as proactively preparing, what you are doing now, proactively preparing for the impacts of grief experiences on employee well-being and workflow. Not just who we are, but how the work needs to be held, knowing and assuming that there will always be a griever and there will be grievers with whom we work. And being prepared to meet the needs of grieving employees by developing the policies and cultural norms for them to thrive at work. So a policy is just written words on paper. The way it becomes alive and impacts us has to be in the fascia, in the heartbeat of the organization. So this is how we are defining grief readiness. We are assuming that there will always be grief and there will be a griever amongst us, in you. And this conversation is necessary for our workforce development, retention, recruitment, etc. Last week talked about all the different types of grief: collective, ambiguous, anticipatory, secondary, and then grief from other losses other than death, which we've all experienced very much in the last 3 years acutely. For today's session, we're just going to invite you to focus when we think about case studies or we think about applying this work, to kind of narrow it down so we don't get overwhelmed by all the possibility of what this could look like, to narrow it into someone who might be experiencing an acute state of grief from a recent death loss. So the hypothetical is someone you manage coming to you and saying, I've experienced a death in my immediate family. Now what? We're going to start section 1, and this is our section to think about how do we even roll out this idea of grief readiness at work, of navigating and confronting loss at work. And last week we talked about there being 4 phases, not the 5 or 6 stages, but 4 phases that we're introducing in our starter kit. The first is being ready. That's where we are right now. The second is thinking about how do we welcome back our colleagues, even presuming that they're physically gone, even though we know that there can be a lot of presenteeism when you're at work, but you're actually not at work. How do we equip and engage managers, which we're going to get into in section 2, and then how do we maintain it? So I'm also just naming that, again, there's lots of loss that is being mentioned in the chat. So we're just holding both compassion and clarity of what is bringing us together in our purpose today. So MP, I'm going to pass it off to you.
Thank you. So I want to just share in this section today, ultimately what I'll be going through are some frames, not the frames, but some options for different ways to think through and self-inquire when thinking about how to support grieving coworkers, including ourselves, which I spoiler David will get into a little bit more afterward. But just to move through some different ways that we think about this at workplace resilience, the thing I want to highlight here is this question of what are we aiming for? What does a grief-ready workplace look like to you? And so I invite you even to just kind of hold that question in your mind today and in this moment. And a lot of what we talk about in workplace resilience is, what is this opportunity to strengthen collective care? What's this opportunity to strengthen our workplace culture? And seeing these not just as, the reality is productivity will be changed when people are coming in with a loss experience, but how can we see it also as an opportunity for deeper teamwork, deeper collaboration, deeper meaning? So I want to be clear that these arrows here aren't we're going to feel isolated, we're going to feel overwhelmed. As Leora said earlier, death, loss, grief are realities of our lives and ones that we take into work, whether they happen at work or somewhere else. But just kind of highlighting here that we can think about this in terms of what are we aiming for collectively too. So on the next slide, I like to give this example. You can read this quote from one of the members of our dinner party community. And the idea here is that grief impacts us in the workplace, whether it's one person who's experiencing a loss in their personal lives, or a coworker dying, or a student, shared client, someone else in the community that lots of folks know dying, whether it's a shared loss or an individual person's loss. These things have an impact on the whole team. So I encourage you to be thinking about this from a systems mindset too. So in this quote, I like to highlight that this was an experience someone shared of an individual on their team experiencing a loss and grieving that loss and taking some time off. And it did have a ripple impact that could have been and was experienced as difficult for some of the teammates, but it was also simultaneously experienced as something that built some confidence, that gave an opportunity for collaboration. I often remind people that people often want to support and aren't necessarily sure how. We don't always have the relationship with our coworkers where we become the listening ear or the person who sends flowers, but we might have a relationship where we take on some of their workload, and that becomes a really important thing too. It gives a sense of pride and security in the workplace too. So thinking about how does this impact the whole team? How do we support the whole team? And how do we get the whole team supporting each other? That's how we often like to approach it. So on the next slide, this is a bit of a refresher of last time Leora went into it too. But as we think about today, later on, we'll talk about some nitty-gritty strategies and ideas across those different stages that Leora just described. And really thinking about that as grief is not a monolithic experience, that what we experience is changed so much, and we went into this deeply last time, is changed so much by the circumstances of the loss of our lives, whether that again is something that someone experienced personally and they're the only person at their workplace who knew the person who died, whether it was a sudden loss, whether it was also a traumatic loss, all of those different, or not, or had a long runway of anticipatory grief. All of these things play in. Thinking about the power dynamics, refreshing back for those who were here last time to the wheel of power that Leora walked us through, and thinking about power dynamics on a systemic level and how those play out at work. If you are the one person of color on your team, if your workplace has not been super accommodative around ableism in general, or different abilities in general, but also thinking about simply the power dynamics of what feels safe or not safe to bring up to a supervisor. What is different about when a peer loses someone and you want to support them versus people kind of at these different levels of very real workplace hierarchies. Thinking certainly about just the individual relationships that people have, the cultural norms that we hold, whether we live in a culture and whether your primary experience is of cultures where grief is taboo, sadness signifies weakness, taking time off work is not contributing enough. versus, or in addition to, cultures where perhaps you have rituals for memorializing, where ancestors are talked about often, where these different practices hold different kind of containers for us to move through our grief. So thinking about how all of those come into play in an individual loss experience, in our personal experiences, and certainly alongside the people who we are working alongside too. So in the next slide, continuing to think about how grief is not a monolith. And, later we'll be talking about things like bereavement policies, like the different protocols and ways of communicating that we have. And all of that is not to say that, grief is one singular event where you're strategizing around what to do when people are really sad or don't want to do anything, because certainly that's not always our experience. And sometimes in grief, there are feelings of relief, sometimes we want to come to work and have that sense of purpose. And so thinking too, when we're building policies, when we're strategizing through our grief readiness plans, particularly later today and beyond, thinking through that these are all for particular experiences in the lives of particular people, that what we're responding to is, oh, some people can't prioritize in the same way. Some people are going to show up to work after not getting enough sleep. Some people are moving through a time in their lives where their social connections and their own sense of identity are really interrupted. And what do our policies do to respond to that, to specify around that, to adapt around that? So this is really just a reminder of the multiplicity, the specificity of things that we're really thinking through and responding to as we create our grief readiness plans. And on the next slide, again, sort of relatedly, thinking about how our different relational dynamics, roles, positions, all of those things frame how we support people. And so you could think about this certainly within, an individual experience of you supporting a coworker, you being supported in a grief experience, and how that would differ based on the kind of decision-making power you have, based on the kinds of connections you have, if you're the director of an organization, or if you're a peer supporting a peer, if you're on the same team or not. So I want you, as we move through today, kind of thinking about these different layers too, of how does this differ? What is my role in the organization I'm at right now? And where does that open up different capacities and create certain kinds of limitations? So if we move into the next slide, we'll take a few minutes to reflect. And on page 17, you'll also see the same concentric ring graphic as you see on here, as well as some more detail for kind of what to think about here. But thinking about your sphere of influence, which is not just defined by those particular roles within a workplace. They are influenced too by things like our individual positionality within social structures. They're influenced too by our own emotional capacities and other capacities at any given moment, our particular skills, gifts, relationships. So you'll see even some questions on page 17 of the workbook. What are the conversations you can have? What are the things you can advocate for? What are the relationships you have? As well as what are the decisions you can and can't make?
And I want to acknowledge that part of our invitation of thinking about your sphere of influence is to release anything that came up in your head of, I don't have power to do this. I can't, etc. Because all of us, whether we are a former manager, supervisor, we are all uppercase leaders and lowercase leaders, that it matters. It matters how we talk to one another, how we invite one another, and even you being here is you influencing your workplace because you're shifting. And we talked about last week that David's section of simply, and it's not simple, simply understanding the nuances between grief and trauma and bereavement and loss, and how it's all both intersected and different in itself can be extremely powerful. So again, my invitation for you in this next section, whereas it might feel like, to find the one piece, to be kind to yourself, to find the one piece that you want to hold on to so that you don't get into kind of allostatic overload. but that you can find one piece. So here we go. We're going to talk about being a manager, supervisor, or leader in the context of loss. So we want to move in. This is the basic. We want to move as managers, supervisors, leaders, project directors, whatever title you want to name in the section that we're in right now. We want to move from assumptions into agreements, both explicit and implicit, mostly explicit. So an assumption speaks to what we talked about last week, which is this concept of grief bias, or this assuming that no one is grieving, assuming that everyone grieves like me, assuming that if they have 3 days off, they're okay, or assuming that no one wants to talk about it, or assuming that everyone wants to talk about it, right? There are lots of assumptions. And a lot of it really speaks to that power of really reflecting on ourselves as managers, supervisors, and leaders to be clear about what we are stepping into the work with an already listening for. My colleague, Derek Canty, who many of you have met, he calls it already listening. When you walk into a conversation or a party or a meeting or a scenario and you are already expecting what's going to happen, that's an assumption. We want to move into an explicit agreement so that we can be boundaried and be attuned to the needs of both the individuals in our organization and the culture of our organization. So I'm going to give an example of what that can sound like. I had someone on our team who experienced the death of one of their parental figures. This is not someone that they considered a parent. This is someone they considered a parental figure. And I want to also say that because some of the times we talk about grief, assuming that it means that it was someone who was deeply loving and caring and a really meaningful relationship. And actually grief involves oftentimes the loss or death of someone who is abusive or toxic or hard to talk about, that erupts a lot. So that's even an assumption in itself. We don't talk about that a lot as a society. So let's go back to the case situation. They came to me as their supervisor and said, this person died in my family. I do not want an organizational response about it. This person was really hard for me. I do not want an organizational response about it. Okay, so let's talk about that for a moment. Two things. One is that they did want time off and they took time off. The non-negotiable that we talked about is that we needed to come up with a shared agreement of what language we were using in emails for what their time off was for. They felt like they were respected and their colleagues knew how to boundary their time. And we came up with a negotiated way for me to share with the rest of the team about why we were not sending a card, why we were not sending flowers, so that people didn't interpret silence as toxic from the leadership perspective, or silence as unthoughtful. So I'm giving an example of what it means to explicitly work with someone to come up with consent around how we talk about what we need. I'm really going to welcome you in this section to offer your own sentence stems and what people have said or done with you in explicit agreement so that we can learn from one another, right? So again, another agreement is, for me as a manager, I would like to ask you when you come back from work, for example, how is your grief today? How does that land with you? They can say, yes, no, it's better than how are you? And it acknowledges where I'm at, right? There's one thing that we played with. So moving from assumptions to agreements. I want to offer again that on pages 27 to 30 of our starter kit, that we offer 10 principles to guide conversations with grieving employees. So we want to think about being conscious of time and place. I think we can all think of worst case scenarios, like on a Zoom with 70 people, none of whom that person knows, to say condolences to Leora without their consent or permission, and then there's a flood or silent reaction, right? We're going to think about the time and place of both either having a conversation with that person or also sharing that person's lived experience. So that might mean that speaks to that cultural norm. If you have a cultural norm as a reflective supervisor that you're meeting with someone every week, that might be the appropriate place to have the conversation. Or it might mean after you get an email with a notice of someone's acute grief, that you say, I hear you, I'd like either by email or in a phone call, whatever you prefer, to talk about XYZ. So there's a modality of consent. I'm going to offer us to stay away from cliche sayings and attitudes. So please feel free to offer the what not to do is also in the chat. I'm so sorry for your loss. Well, again, as we talked about, sometimes losses aren't necessitating sorriness. Sometimes losses are just losses. And we can say, either I'm sorry for your loss and I'm saying that because I don't know what else to say. That's a second sentence. Or we can say, what can I say to you right now that might provide some comfort? And even that question gives them autonomy and consent. What we're not going to say is they're in a better place. I mean, help me add in the chat box all the hallmark hallmark cliches. They're in a better place, etc., etc. I want to again underscore the offering support that's really specific. That's an explicit agreement. It's not how can I support you. All of us have been in really overwhelming experiences where when someone says, how can I support you? It's a really hard question to answer. It's a really hard question to answer. Oh, good. Someone's saying like, cut it with like, you're in my thoughts and prayers. Except if that person says, please pray for me. Please keep me in your thoughts and prayers, right? Then there's consent. But we want to offer support that's specific. So, and MP and David, you can help me in the chat box to give examples of what this feels like. But when we offer support that's specific, it means me as your manager and supervisor, here's what I can offer you. And also, I may not be the only person who can offer you support. Here are some other colleagues. Here's some other colleagues who might be able to connect with you or to help you, HR or the like. I'm really grateful that folks are just like chiming in on things of what not to say, which is, I know exactly how you feel. Let me tell you about what happened to me and bring back the focus to me. Yes, beautiful. Okay. The fourth is to identify that person's options, but reaffirm their agency. So one big actor of loss, grief, or trauma is this feeling of powerlessness, that something happened to me rather than from me, with me, alongside me. So again, that's why I keep reiterating the power of consent and co-constructing the game plan. And by the way, you can do this not in the aftermath of acute grief. It's actually, if you're creating a grief-sensitive workplace, it might be totally appropriate when you've got a team member and a group of trust, if you have trust on your team members, that you can say, so we might all experience loss here or grief here. What do we need or what would we like in that moment? And do some forecasting. It doesn't mean that that will be what they need in the moment, but you can at least start the conversations now ahead of time. Okay, this fifth one, colleagues, is the hardest for us as humans. Our prefrontal cortex, we want to know the who, what, where, why, how. Knowing less is more. I don't need to know how they died. I don't need to know why they died. I don't need to know the details. I just need to know the headline that you have experienced acute death and that either you need time off, you want to stay at work, or XYZ. Okay? Is not the invitation from a supervisor to say, oh my God, what happened? Not necessary. And even if you walk alongside that person and you experience the same death event and you know the details, it's not even necessary to surface those. You can actually be grief supporting and grief sensitive without needing to know the details and just know the headlines. Okay, I'm going to go through a couple more and then we're going to get into some reflection questions. So again, we're going to avoid advice giving or assuming you know what's best for them. I'm going to say that twice for the folks in the back of the bus. We are going to avoid advice giving or assuming you know what's best for them. You might have worked with this person for 20 years. Please do not assume. Please ask for explicit agreement about how you can show up for them. We do not always know what's best for someone else. They are their own lived experiencer. It's a new word. So we want to avoid advice giving. You can also, again, ask for consent. I have some thoughts about something connected to my experience that might be helpful. How or would you like that offered? So I want to offer, I'll offer a case study example, which is that in another organization that I worked, we had a colleague, two colleagues in separate moments who experienced fires in their apartments and crisis related to those fires. Colleague A, who had experienced it in the past, sent an email and just said, I have some learned experience and advice. If you ever want it, I'm here. Just let me know and I'll send it. It was not a dump. It was I'm here when you'd like to access it. And sure enough, employee 2, when they had regulated, was able to access employee 1's advice. Okay, last couple, which is to listen and ask open and honest questions. So this one comes with a little bit of a caveat that we are not, again, assuming that just because you are someone's manager, leader, or supervisor, that you are their therapist, even if you're a behavioral health trained clinician or medical provider. So for those of you who are directors of behavioral health and everyone turns to you for their grief work, you can also boundary and say, I really want to support you. This feels like a conversation that I want you to be able to have more extensive support with beyond what I'm able to as your colleague, right? And the honest questions can sound like this. I don't really know what to say or do right now. Is there one thing you'd like me not to do? That sometimes is easier to identify than what to do. Is there anything you'd like me not to do or not to say? Okay, we're gonna erase the pity face and instill confidence. So if we look at, if someone in our workplace is experiencing acute grief and we're looking at them like this, every time they're on Zoom, it may not make them feel safe. It might make them only feel like we are seeing them as a griever and not as our colleague who has massive competencies and skills and gifts into the work. So we're going to try and get rid of the pity face or just be in our own sorrow for them, our deep compassion and empathy for them offline with someone else, so that we're in relationship with them, especially if we're their manager, supervisor, or leader, where there's already a power dynamic, that's not a dynamic in the room. Last two, stick with me. Last two. The last is to make a plan and follow up. Last two is to make a plan and follow up. So if someone is needing to be off for 3 days and they're coming back, that it is absolutely appropriate to say, before they go on leave, I'd like us to come back together when you return so we can check in to the degree you'd like to check in and see what you need in order to welcome back, right? So we're making a plan and following up. It could also mean, here's the workflow that we're readjusting. Let's check in with you in 2 weeks to see if that workflow is still appropriate. They could say, I actually want more. More work actually makes me feel more competent and more focused on the now versus what I'm going through, or I might need less. Okay, and again, this is the repeat question that we offered last session and that MP also stated, which is, how would an employee's experience differ if they were different in their race or age or tenure, seniority, location, gender, sexual orientation, ability, religion, role, or vocalness? And that really, really, really speaks also to our own grief bias. Are we anticipating or expecting or assuming that someone will want something that we want? Okay. Before I punt it to David, I'm going to just underscore a teaching he just offered in the chat, which is that don't worry about making mistakes. Also, AKA, we are all going to make mistakes and we all have made mistakes. And it's never too late, by the way, to say to your colleague, ooh, I just attended this grief sensitive Getting Grief Ready webinar, and I think I said something last year that I really, really would like to redo. And here we go. Okay, so before we offer it to David, I just want to invite you to pick one. We're not going to do the full 3 to 5 minutes, but I'm going to offer you to pick one of these 10 principles that you want to focus on. You can put it in the chat for collective accountability, or you can just hold it in for yourself. This is on pages 27 through 30. Pick one principle that you would like to hold on to. Practice stems from what you were inviting you not to do anymore. How did they die? You poor thing. To how can I as a manager be most supportive to you? Or at the moment, what's the best way for us to check in about all this? So you've got sentence stems for you to start to practice. So inherent to not only learning the sentence stems and the 10 principles is also how to support yourself, because inherently we are all empathetic humans. Sometimes some of us distance ourselves from that empathy in order to cope, but we really are empathetic humans. And so part of this work is also to manage our own professional self-care, which is a term that's gotten to mean nothing because it's meant everything, but it really in this context means how you can support your own grief activation as you support other people. So in this deck, we're giving you some reflection questions. We really invite you to marinate in them when you get them. I'm going to hand it to David.
I wanted to start by saying that we can give you advice of what to say and what not to say. And sometimes it sounds so simple, but it really isn't that simple because you have to do it while everything else is going on. So in order to achieve wellness, you need to address personal self-care, but you also have to process personal losses while trying to reorder the priority of service to others, which limits personal focus. So it really is kind of a funnel. You're trying to do a lot of things at the same time, but only one or two gets out at the bottom at any one moment. So these situations are often quite complicated in workplaces. So you may have a workplace death that can be associated with personal grief of the supervisor or guilt of the supervisor or other difficult personal emotions. I remember talking to one supervisor. She had a new assistant. The assistant was struggling a little bit. She wasn't quite sure how to help her. And then during the break, the assistant went outside and jumped off the roof of the garage to where they worked. And so now this supervisor was trying to figure out what she had done wrong, what she had missed, how she might have been more helpful, but she also had to then try and assist her employees and figure out what policies and procedures they would put in place. Or processing of personal losses may be due to past unrelated losses. There have been a couple situations now where I have worked with schools where there has been a death of a student, often by suicide, and an administrator doesn't even want to talk about it or acknowledge it at all. Once I actually took a principal off campus out for breakfast and got to know him a little bit better, and he disclosed that his parent had died by suicide, and he said, I can't even touch this topic. And then he concluded, but I cannot allow it not to be dealt with. So he then went back and talked to all of his staff and apologized for the lack of activity and said he would do better. Processing of personal losses may also be due to personal or family losses that are unrelated to the current death or even the cause of death. So maybe that you have a relative who has died recently or is seriously ill from something completely unrelated, and loss is just too close to you to be able to address that. And the resistance may also be due to fears of contagion and suicide, for example. I've had now a couple schools recently where they didn't talk about it because they didn't want someone else to die by suicide, but then people felt unsupported because of that lack of acknowledgement. Or there may be lawsuits or concerns about lawsuits. Leaders are often in positions where they get blamed for deaths that have occurred in the workplace setting. And so they may be hesitant to say anything. And then another way it gets really complicated is the death may actually be the supervisor. And then that totally disorients the team and makes it difficult to respond. I remember talking to one principal in the height of the pandemic when people were still working remotely. The principal had actually died, not related to COVID. And now I'm talking to the new principal. And he also then shared with me that the assistant principal expected to become principal, but he was assigned from outside the school and knew that the staff already resented him. Now he had to then deal with the pandemic, deal with his own personal feelings, and try and be supportive to people who are already angry with him. So it's complicated. So if you go into the next slide, It's complicated, but it's important. So we need to recognize it's distressing to be with people who are in distress, simply stated. Sometimes it's just distressing to be with people in general, but particularly when they're in distress. So we have to find ways to have our personal needs met and appreciate and address the impact of supporting others who are grieving, traumatized, or otherwise distressed. And so what we have to do is we have to think about how we are going to do that. We have to create a culture where simply it's okay to be upset when upsetting things happen, where we encourage and practice introspection on personal coping. I know I reflect periodically how I'm doing when I'm responding to people who are distressed or responding to a crisis situation, because I do this a lot. One of the cues I have noticed in myself is I misplace things when I'm overwhelmed. So if I lose something, even if it's a pen that costs $1.50, I reflect on why did I lose it? If it got lost in the tray in TSA, I move on and I get a new pen. But if it's because I left it somewhere, then I ask myself, am I moving too quickly? Am I trying to take on too much? Am I not taking care of myself? And then sometimes I need to make sure that I remedy that situation. I do want to, we also have to make sure that members normalize asking for help and model a willingness to accept assistance. And we have to prioritize organizational and institutional support above reliance on personal self-care. So we tend, when we talk about personal or professional self-care, to imply that if you are having difficulty, it's because you're not good enough at this. You're not a good enough professional. Instead of just saying, this is a really complicated and difficult situation, and making sure that your organization creates the system that supports you through. We don't want to blame the employee for being stressed when they're in a stressful situation. We want to make sure that we give them support. And you can communicate when you would like some additional support without feeling like you have to share personal details or information that you're not comfortable with in the workplace setting. So I'm going to tell one little example from when I was a resident. I had just started on the oncology ward at a children's hospital the week they had opened the first bone marrow transplant unit, one of the first in the country. And it wasn't very pretty in the beginning. A lot of children suffered a great deal and many died. So we began our rounds on the oncology unit in the chapel with a moment of reflection. And so one day I used to have a topper on my pen that children would distract children when I was doing the physical exam. And one day I noticed it was getting kind of dirty. So I went to the gift shop and I bought some more, but I didn't have a locker. I had 36-hour shifts and all I had was the scrubs I was wearing. So I didn't know where to put the extra ones. So I put them on top of other pens that I had on the ward. And so the senior resident looked at me in the morning and he said, why do we have so many ODs today? And I, just as a joke, I was being sarcastic. I said, it was a hard night. And from that point on, I communicated what my night on call was by the number of ODs on the pens in my pocket. If it was a 1 OD night, he said, good. And I'd say, yeah, I got some sleep. There weren't many admissions. And then one day I put 5 up. And I remember he looked at me and he said, I can't even imagine what a 5 OD night is like. Please hand over your beeper, go take a shower, get some breakfast. We're here for you. So the issue is, was that a silly way of communicating? Yes. But it's sillier not to communicate. So you need to think about how you can say to someone, this is a tough day for me, or I'm having some issues with my family. I could appreciate some help with this, or I've experienced a death or a loss, and it would be nice if you could help me in this way. So go on to the next slide if you can. This work, though, as I said, is difficult, and I want to acknowledge that. Exposure to the trauma and suffering of others can lead to what we call compassion fatigue. Empathy was already mentioned by Leora, and that involves understanding and taking the perspective of another. But compassion goes even beyond empathy and includes wanting to help and or desiring to relieve the suffering of another person. It actually, the Latin root is to bear or suffer together. And it's that shared nature which we need to acknowledge. So warnings about compassion fatigue tend to, though, imply that compassion is necessarily tiring, as if you have just a certain amount of compassion, and if you care too much or about too many people, you're going to run out of it and you're going to get burnt out. But compassionate approaches can actually be gratifying and bring meaning to the work that we do and decrease burnout. If you go to the next slide. So what we want to do is have realistic objectives of the purpose of our interactions. If you're trying to support an employee who is grieving, you're not supposed to try and make them happy. You're just supposed to help them so they can begin to cope with something that's difficult. You have to have the skills and the resources to provide meaningful assistance, and many administrators don't actually have great skills in this area. To be quite candid, I know this from academic medicine, that people who become department chairs are not generally people who have their greatest strength in emotional intelligence. They tend to be people who got a lot of funding for their grant, which was done in a lab where they usually interacted with something like a mold. So they're not necessarily the most skilled at this, but it isn't a requirement as an administrator that you do this extremely well. It's just a requirement that you make sure it is done well. So you can ask others to do it for you and with you. You don't have to take on all the responsibility. So you also have to have the resources. And right now, I just want to be candid, that is difficult. Staffing and money is in short supply. So you have to be realistic about what you can do and how you can do it. And then you have to be aware of and have sufficient support to deal with the personal impact of work. And this, of course, is particularly difficult when you're in a very challenging situation, such as after a disaster or when there's been a crisis. I still remember my wife came to hear me speak once, and she said to me in a small group, and she said, you know, it was rather subtle, but there were some stories that you said, and I could tell that they still affected you. And I looked at her and I said, so what's your point? And she said, well, what are we going to do about it? And I remember looking at her going, dear, what do you plan on doing about it? Like, what are you saying? And she said to me, well, I don't want you to be uncomfortable. And I remember looking at her and saying, I don't want to be uncomfortable either. But if I ever go to a school that's had a mass shooting and it doesn't upset me, then that's a problem. Part of this work is you need to be empathic, and it does affect us. So it isn't a problem if it bothers you. It's a problem if you don't know how to cope with that so that it doesn't hurt you. We go to the last slide. This section. So really, there are some problematic thoughts about self-care that we need to challenge. One is feeling shame or guilt for attending to your own needs. You need to attend to your needs so you can attend to the needs of others. Making time when there are others who need your assistance and there's limited resources and staffing, such as there is now, but you need to make that time, again, so you can continue to be available and accessible to people. Assuming others are having less trouble adjusting, most people, professionals, hide their distress. Mental health providers are even better at this. It is not a superpower. It's actually a challenge. We need to be able to convey when we have distress so that people can assist us. Assuming that the supervisor or your board expects you, whether you're a mental health provider or you do work in bereavement, that you're professional in this area and you should be able to handle your own grief because of your career. Knowledge does not make grief go away. And so many situations, I've been talking to directors of grief programs, and they'll just say to me, I know how to do this for others, I just don't know how to do it for myself. And I usually say to them, you shouldn't be expected to do it for yourself. You should accept the help of others. Assuming you should be able to handle your own grief more effectively because of your training and experience is the same thing. And then sometimes feeling unworthy of support because of associated guilt. I made a mistake. I didn't deal with this wrong. People shouldn't be helping me. They should be helping the people I'm responsible for because I'm not doing a good job of it. You should still accept help for yourself because this is difficult work. You go on to the next slide. That's just the reflection question. And I think in order to keep us on track, I'm going to keep that brief, if that's okay, Leora. So what I want you to think about is, what's your takeaway from this? What are your already existing strengths? And more importantly, what commitment are you going to make to yourself to try and address this better for your own personal self-care as you do this work? Because I think it's admirable that you want to figure out how to create a plan for your workplace, but I want you to make sure you also create a plan for yourself. What are you going to do so that while you're doing better by others, you're doing just as good for yourself?
So we're moving into our closing section, which is crafting a grief readiness plan. You will not leave this with a beautiful color-coded strategic plan for your grief readiness. In fact, your grief readiness plan, again, can simply be this work you're doing here right now. So I just want to, again, level the expectation. The question that MP will be leading us through and that we'll end with is, what is your plan? And again, plan may not be in an Excel format or a Gantt chart. It could be your commitment to bringing more equity and proactiveness into how your organization responds to grief, including your own work.
So in this section, as Leora kind of cued us into, things are going to get pretty nitty gritty, pretty concrete, pretty fast. And so the invitation I want to offer here is, that might feel like a jolt, but it was very intentional for us to start our time and to lead into this time, thinking about how are we caring for ourselves while caring for others. That those things, that the reflection questions you started with today about what it's like to be a griever in your workplace, what you're noticing about your colleagues in times of grief, all of those things are really the undergirding here, the questions that we're asking ourselves. And so as we move through this section, what I'll do is I'll go into each of these stages very quickly, but in a little bit more detail than here. And my invitation to you will simply be to notice, what do I know I already do well, or that my organization already does well? What could be worth exploring? What is surprising? What haven't I thought about before? So I'll be sharing some examples for each section. Leora's already shared a lot of examples for the middle two here. And I'll invite you to, throughout the whole time, to share things in the chat that might benefit your colleagues, that you might look for some resonance from your colleagues in this around. And I think, again, framing this in terms of grief readiness, that as David just reminded us, suffering and distress aren't inherently only disempowering, disenfranchising, that they aren't things that make us unable to do things, but are a very important part of being empathic and compassionate, and what, the assets that we bring to our work. But the question in readiness is, can we create cultures, structures, systems where we make space to make meaning of that, where we make space to make connections of that, have different parts of the organism, the collective, show up for each other in that. And you'll see, if you're a detail-oriented person, you might notice that these are in a slightly different order than they were earlier, than they are in your workbook. And part of that is also that all of these things flow into each other, that you're not just starting from the beginning, get ready, but that all of you have expressed grieving experiences that have happened in your life and in your work. And so it's this continuous cycle of how are we continuing to evaluate, reevaluate, reassess, and keep adapting our structures, plans, systems, strategies, etc., based on what we're learning, based on the changing realities of our lives. So in the next slide, we'll move into the get ready phase. And the big question here is, what policies, protocols, and norms are in place? And on the next slide, I'll invite you into the chat if you want to share. And some of you did last week if you were here. One of those things that you already have in place to support grieving employees. Some of you mentioned this earlier too, but I think it's worth asking yourself too, what's something you're not sure you or your organization have? And the reason that I bring that up, and do feel free to chat some of those things in for each other to see, is that on the next slide, these are some quotes from, we're getting there. Yeah, some quotes from people in our community. One simply asked about their grieving experiences. And so often do we hear like, I actually don't know if we have bereavement leave. I'm not really sure what we do. People aren't usually looking at that before they sign contract. It's not often what we're thinking about or expecting, particularly because we're often culturally trained to kind of avoid and hope to distance ourselves from that part of our lives and realities, even if we're in lines of work where death happens a lot, even in our communities. So I share this to kind of normalize that, as well as, again, knowing what we're aiming for, what we're hoping for, and thinking about if you're a manager or have other kind of, relational power, thinking about how am I communicating what the resources that we do have are to people so that they're not just looking it up in times of distress. So next slide. I'll just power through a bunch of examples. You're already sharing some of them. You're sharing some other ones. I know last week we had a lot of questions about bereavement leave, and the thing I'd sort of offer is even going back to some of those 10 tenets of, thinking about specificity. Some examples, I mean, Leora talked about like parental figures might be different relationships for us. And often we see on bereavement policies, many organizations will say something like 3 days for a close family member and less or none at all for others. But what does that mean if you're estranged from your family of origin? What does that mean if in your personal life or in your community, grandparents or auntie is a stronger relationship or a similar relationship to that you might have with a parents? Last week, we talked about the very common experience of pregnancy loss. And that's what I hear about often as something where people aren't really sure if they can take their leave for that. And that's an extremely vulnerable and personal thing for a lot of people to bring up to people who have power over their job or are simply their bosses or are not necessarily the people they want to talk to about that in a time of vulnerability. There are things that we can be specific about, and there are things that we can be ready to adapt around. So this isn't kind of a call to name every particular scenario on your bereavement leave policies. But it is, going back to those manager skills of, are you ready to say like, we can offer this much, but you could use PTO for this, or you can work from home on these days, or we can adapt these things. So just some other things to think about here. And I'll also point you to, in the workbook on pages 22 to 24, there are some really evocative questions for all of these phases, 22 for the get ready stage in particular. And I think we looked at that a little bit last time. And we'll move through to the next slide. I know some of you mentioned things like EAPs. So thinking about other support resources, employee assistance programs and mental health referrals, but also the legal and financial referrals that are often offered by EAPs are something that might be really important to mention to folks who are grieving. If you're in a workplace where a community-wide loss is felt, such as a coworker or a student or shared client. What are the outside support systems for your team? What are the cultural norms for that? So for instance, I used to work at a social service provider where we worked with seniors, we worked with folks who were presently or formerly unsheltered, people who were navigating the effects of substance addictions, and so certainly loss was very much a part of the rhythm. People were losing clients often. And so every year we had a day when those people were named. The people who we had lost in our community were named, including coworkers and clients, residents, and so on. We had a team who was ready to respond if people wanted to have a memorial service among staff or among the other people in that person's life. That might be the only affordable space available, in our case, free. We had 1-hour groups that were during paid time for employees to kind of share experiences with each other and process things. On a regular basis. And so that made a space for people to be able to share about the things that were hard in their work or the things that were hard in their personal lives that were maybe impacting their work or coming up and triggering experiences in work. So we'll move on to the next section, but seeing a lot of ideas, activity response in the chat that I encourage you to engage with your colleagues as well. So equip and engage, and Leora got into some of this for sure. It's all about how's the whole team prepared to adapt when it comes to workflow and workload. And just the question I'd offer to you, and there are more of these on page 23, but one question on the next slide that I like to think about here is that realistically, we do have experiences where we've had to adapt, whether it was in the event of an unexpected or expected loss on our team, or when people have had to take time off for parental leave, or when COVID hit unexpectedly and changed the ways that our workloads and workflows happened. So We'll breeze through this section too on the next slide. But I want you to be thinking about, what are those times you've had to adapt? What are the lessons, the communication skills that you learned from that? And feel free to kind of share some of those things or some of the things that were challenging in the chat as well. And again, you'll get some of these slides if you want to come back to them. Many of the things are in the workbook. Excuse me. So a lot of this in the, in Equip and Engage, thinking about workflow, workload, some of it is about the manager skills Leora shared about. But what I want to emphasize here and kind of in these points is thinking about communication and empowerment. How are we being clear? How are we, again, going back to what Leora was sharing about consent and agreements instead of assumption? How are we making this an empowering situation for coworkers to participate in the support of their team member, for people to have an opportunity to have the meaning-making experiences that we often have at work. And again, thinking about where those opportunities are before, during, and after a loss. I think a lot of this is about getting ready too, and sort of seeing, having a sense, if you're doing group case consult or things like that, of what's flexible, adaptable, delayable, what's not. And we can move into the next slide as well. I really like to emphasize this first one of cross-training, of having people who are ready to pick up each other's work when need be and normalizing that. So for instance, I can think of one organization where it's the norm for people to spend, they run various sites, different housing programs, healthcare, respite care, all sorts of things. And so it's very normal for people to spend one day of their week at another site so that people are ready to jump in as needed. Or that might be part of your onboarding protocol, is for people to shadow people in other roles so that at least when somebody isn't able to get support from their normal mental health care provider, or if you're in a school, so that everybody knows all the other teachers, so that the folks, who are impacted are able to have a sense of trust and rapport with the other people around too. And we'll move into the next slide, which is simply a quote. You can read it now or later to yourself, but what I want to emphasize here is that, this goes back to kind of what was shared earlier of often we're very worried about what exactly to say when people are really just looking for some sort of acknowledgement, when looking for this goes back to what was shared again about assumptions versus agreements, that often we're very scared to say anything at all. And David pointed this out too. It's what I hear from everyone. It's what I felt myself, that often it's more painful for people to not say anything at all than to say the wrong thing. And so our ability to adapt there, our ability to give it a try and then adapt and kind of let people take it as they will and learn from our situation. So we'll move into the next section. And there's kind of another quote example there of thinking about how this also impacts, welcoming people back isn't just about the right words, but is about that workload piece, that what we're ultimately often most worried about, or I've felt as a griever and what I've heard from several people, is that when people come back to work or when people take time off from work, what they're really concerned about is just their work getting done. And so some of this is about scaling that back, thinking about what kinds of settings are going to be supportive while people are re-navigating, adjusting back into their rhythms, while people are re-navigating things like continuing to plan funeral arrangements and cleaning out a house. What kinds of flexibility in terms of somebody's ability to work from home, take on different projects, temporarily hold a different role, temporarily let go of or delay certain things. I think that's all we're thinking about too. Often we're thinking about, what do I say right when I hear that somebody has lost someone, or right when I hear that someone in our community has died. But a lot of what the last couple of sections are about is proactiveness. And a lot of what this one is about is the reality that grief takes time, changes over time, shows up when we least expect it or when we most expect it. And so thinking about how we support people beyond the acute moment. So if we go to the next slide, there are just a few examples you can revisit. For instance, at my work, we allow people to take time off for death anniversaries. And so that's something I've communicated with my supervisor about, like they know what some of those significant dates are for me. They have that on their calendar. And we check in around that time if I'm feeling affected by it or not. I take that day off, even if I'm not feeling super sad, because it's meaningful time for me to connect with family, to participate in ritual, to just take a moment to pause and make meaning out of that. So we can think about some different ways that, you know, in an interpersonal relationship, in a manager supervisee relationship, or as peers, or as a collective, we can name and pay attention to some of those dates as well.
We're offering you, both in the starter kit and in these 2 decks that you're getting, lots of options for you to identify 1, 2, or 3 things that you want to commit to in your own learning and your team's learning. Not everything needs to happen at once. That would actually be the opposite of grief sensitive to yourselves and to your own nervous systems, right? Showing you what is already in the grief starter kit, if you're not familiar with it, that on pages 34 through 36, we walk you through a kind of SMART goals strategic plan, so that, because I'm naming that some of you came into this session wanting, how do I bring this to my team? These are some of the questions that you can first sit with, and then potentially a colleague, and then a teammate. That some of this work around implementation science is thinking about this way that we scale culture shift and culture change, especially so that we're not all of a sudden sending an email without any context to 300 people in an agency and saying, we're all grief sensitive now, and here's how, right? That incremental work is actually sometimes the most trauma-informed and kinder work, to figure out where does it hurt the most and start there, right? That's Ruby Sales. Where does it hurt the most? So I want to just offer a couple questions as we close for you to identify in your own work. And I should actually say we, because myself, MP, David, Ingrid, all of us, this is the work we have to do in this moment and now. In what way are we not grief ready, and why? How do we know? What would be the ideal state for us to solve it? Like, wouldn't it be amazing if we, and what could we actually do in the next 6 months? What could we actually do in the next 6 months? We could even scale it back just to this moment, knowing that the winter, dominant culture winter holidays are approaching us, and knowing that for young people who go outside school, that this time and this season evokes a lot, both who is not with us, and that they're, especially if you work with school communities, there is a lot of loss that happens actually over this time. And so just knowing what is the one piece that you as a manager, supervisor, or leader might want to shift in the way that you show up for yourself and others now. So this is our closing. This is our closing, which is on page 41. What is your commitment to yourself? What is your commitment to your team? And what is your most elegant next step? That Adrienne Marie Brown question that we sourced last week, which means it's what is the thing that will take the least taxing effort, not necessarily emotional effort, but taxing effort, that will make really big impact for yourself and others? What is my most elegant next step? Okay. And I want to offer us, as we move into close, it's really, it's understandable to go to the we needs, to send this out to your supervisors, to send, this needs to happen now. I want to just invite you to do a I need. I need to shift, or me and my colleague, or this one person that I'm working with, who I already have a trusting relationship with. What a great way to start being grief sensitive is with someone where there's already that strong relationship, so that you're not necessarily starting with someone where you still have to build that trust. Or you could say, well, maybe doing this is the way we're going to build trust. Okay, so I'm gonna repeat that and then we're gonna move into close. My commitment to myself is, my commitment to my team is, and what is my most elegant next step? We can't fix, solve, or save people from grief, but we can and must do, what we can and must do is to ensure our workplaces lessen the isolation and disconnection that comes from grief and loss. Hold the reality for the distress, create the skills and the capacity and our own resourcing so that we don't get knocked out by the distress, but we collectively and individually navigate it together. For your own integration, if you want to offer one appreciation or one elegant next step, there are lots of references and resources to continue this work.